Okay, so this is in lieu of Friday's class. Well, I guess this is actually Friday's class. And Wednesday we were looking at the evidence for domestication of animals. And we looked at the size of bones decreasing, horn shape changing in goats, and one of the other ways you can see that humans are beginning to control animals is with what are known as culling patterns. Culling patterns are essentially the selection of which animals are going to be killed at certain ages. Right? When you cull a herd, you kill off certain animals at a certain time. So you can tell if humans are actually using animals for certain things by looking at the culling patterns. How does this work? Right here in this diagram, you can see what is known as a survivorship curve. Right? This is down here the ages of the animals, and this is the percentage of the population that's remaining. So at the beginning, when you're at zero, age 0, 100% of the population is there. As you get down to 10 years, you can see that none of the animals are left within that population. And so what you're seeing is a decline in the population over time. How quick that occurs and at what ages can tell you sort of what they were using animals for. So, for example, if you're going to use animals mainly for meat, you're going to kill off your animals at about this age when they reach full adulthood. Right? And so this is where you have this steep drop here. And then the rest of the population produces over here. If you're going to use them mainly for wool, there's no need to kill the animals. Like if you're using sheep for wool, there's no need to kill the animals off early. You let them live as long as they can, which you can see here with the green line, and eventually they decline. All right, what if you're using the animals mainly for milk? Well, the animals that produce milk are obviously the females. The ones that don't produce milk are the males. You only need a few males to keep the herd going. But there are males that compete with you for milk. Those are the young males. So if you're trying to maximize the production of milk, you're actually going to kill off a number of the young males, the juveniles. Keep a lot of the females around, and you can see that here, this sort of a steady decline afterward. Now, if this was a natural profile of a population in the wild, it wouldn't look like this, right? You'd have different ranges of ages. But what this shows, what culling patterns show, is that humans are in control of the animals. They are selecting the animals that are going to be used for different purposes. So, at an archaeological site, if you collected all the bones, you figured out the ages of the bones, that is when they were killed, and you create a graph like this, you can see if they were using the animals mainly for milk, for meat, or for wool. And it turns out that they've done this in the Middle East to see what the animals were used for originally. That is, what was the incentive to domesticate sheep, goat, cow, and pig. And the main incentive is, drum roll, meat. Right? That is, they were mainly domesticating these animals for their meat. Only later, wool and milk became important. Okay, another piece of evidence is if the animals are outside of where they naturally live, right? So if you've got sheep and goat in an area where really wild sheep and goat don't live, that's good evidence that humans were moving them there. Okay, so you've got a number of pieces of evidence. Another piece of evidence is cultural evidence, right? So you might have a picture of an animal being milked or moving a plow or something like that. That's cultural evidence. Or having a puppy buried with someone, like we talked about in the Natufian, right? That's some other cultural evidence of human and animal interaction. Right? So, again, overall the evidence are things like size, horn shape, culling patterns, and also the proportion of different species that are being used. So in the Near East, you see a shift from using a lot of sheep, goat, cattle, but also a lot of gazelle and deer, to later on not using really any gazelle and deer and focusing on the animals that become domesticated. Okay, well now we're going to look at another site in Turkey, which is pretty important actually. So far we've looked at sites here in what's known as the Levant or the Eastern Mediterranean. Right, so we looked at Jericho, which is about here. Abu Huraira is about up here, which is in Syria. So we've really looked at this area. Now we're going to go up into Turkey, right? The central plateau of Turkey, and this is a site known as Çatalhöyük. Çatal just means fork in Turkish, and Höyük is like a tell, it's a mound. So forked mound. You'll see from the picture why it's called that. It's just basically a mound that's split into two. But it's located right here. So again, this is the sites that we've looked at so far. Right? So again, here's Jericho, Ain Ghazal. Remember, is where we saw these plastered family groups. Jericho, we saw plastered skulls. Here's Abu Huraira, where we had the foot bones of women, right, that showed that they were grinding lots of grain. So this is one kind of cultural area right here. And when you get up to Turkey, over here, what's modern-day Turkey, ancient, Anatolia, right here in this high plain, this is where you get a different cultural group. Right? Çatalhöyük was located on a plain up there, and it was a lot better watered back in the Neolithic, around 6000 BC, than it is today. And here you can see that forked mound, right? So here's one mound, here's the other mound. Okay, Çatalhöyük, not surprisingly, was mainly agricultural. It was a fairly large site for the time, right? That is bigger than most sites. That's one of the reasons why it's important, but there are other reasons, as we're going to see. Okay, this is what the architecture looks like as the main excavator in the 60s excavated the site, right? And what you'll notice is when you look at the houses, right, they're built right next to each other, and you actually have very few roads or streets. Very, very few roads or streets. They're really abutting each other, glommed onto each other, and there's a couple theories as to why it was built this way. One is that it prevented flooding or prevented the site from being damaged, the village from being damaged by floods. The other is that it was built this way for defense. We're not really sure which is the correct answer, but what you can see is that to go from one building to the next, you had to go up onto your roof with ladders, walk along the roof to the next house. All right, some of these houses were identified by the archaeologists as being shrines. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit. But they found a number of burials at these under the floors of some of these houses. And in one of the shrines, we'll talk about that again, what a shrine is, but on one of the shrines they saw paintings on the walls. You can see these paintings is probably showing a vulture devouring a corpse. That's what archaeologists think is being represented here. And so probably what this is showing is how they prepared a body for burial. That is, that first they'd lay it out and the vulture would eat off the flesh of the corpse, and then they would take the bones and bury the bones underneath the house floor of these houses. And this kind of treatment of the dead is actually not that uncommon in other cultures. For example, in Tibet and also Parsi cultures, they have what are known as sky burials. Sky burials is where they leave the deceased out in the open. The vultures basically devour the flesh, but this is not seen as something that is dishonorable. It's actually a very honorable way of treating the dead. The vultures are essentially allowing the spirit to leave the body and to ascend up into the heavens, is what people believe who practice sky burial. There are a number of individuals under each house floor. So here you can see underneath the house floor a number of individuals. When someone would die, they would open this up and place another individual in there. These funky clothes you can see here, she kind of looks like a punk rocker. That's actually based on some of the paintings they found on walls. So it's not just some artist making stuff up. It's actually based on what they saw in paintings at the site. This is some of the burials underneath the house floors, right? So you can see there's a number of individuals there. You had difference between men and women in terms of what they're buried with, but it does not look like men had more status than women. It only appears that men and women had different objects in their graves. So for example, this is a woman's burial, and what she has is some red ochre. This is a mineral, and she also has a mirror made out of a important black stone called obsidian. What is obsidian? Obsidian is a black volcanic glass. It's a natural substance. It occurs only in volcanic areas, and it's fairly rare. It only appears in certain areas. So in the Middle East, you have an obsidian source here, right near Çatalhöyük, and you also have an obsidian source here, right? And obsidian is extremely sharp. It's one of the sharpest substances known. It's basically glass, as I said, and it's actually sharper than surgical steel. So before lasers, obsidian scalpels were used for eye surgery, believe it or not. Here are a number of tools that were made at Çatalhöyük, right? Cutting implements, blades from this core, an obsidian mirror. It turns out that Çatalhöyük benefited greatly from the fact that they were located right near an obsidian source, because this was a highly desired trading commodity. And in fact, obsidian from Çatalhöyük is found as far away as Jericho down here, right? So this is really one of the first widely traded commodities in the world. And in fact, in terms of how obsidian got down to Jericho, it was not a direct trading linkage, right? That is, merchants from Çatalhöyük didn't go to Jericho, merchants from Jericho did not go to Çatalhöyük. This was traded from village to village to village to village, all the way down the line, it's called, to Jericho, right? So it's kind of a more diffuse trade network, you could say. Okay, shrines. Well, the main excavator at the site of Çatalhöyük found a number of houses that were slightly different from ordinary domestic houses. About 40 out of 139 that he excavated were highly decorated on the inside, right? And so here you could see some of the normal domestic structures and rooms, right? And some of the activities that would have gone on in there, right? Processing. Here you could see an oven. They would have kept their animals over here. But this is one room. Here's an animal pen right here. This is one room that's highly decorated on the inside. It looks like that was for ritual use, or had ritual importance. Right. This is the excavator in the 60s. What he's doing is peeling off the dirt to reveal the paintings on the plastered walls of some of these shrines. And here you can see that vulture that we saw before, right, devouring a corpse, probably. And here he is peeling off some of the sediment there. Here's a part of a painting, and it's geometric design. Looks a little bit like the rugs that are found in Turkey today. These are two leopards. There were a lot of wild animals depicted on these paintings, and in fact, in this part of Turkey, there were leopards at this time. There's another depiction of a leopard. We think this is made out of plaster right on the wall. Okay, this is what archaeologists think, and this is the reconstruction, and this is the original, right? They think that this is actually Çatalhöyük with the volcano behind it. This is the volcanic peaks that had the obsidian deposits, right? And the volcano is smoking. Only in the past week, archaeologists have found volcanic ash at Çatalhöyük, which they think points to a volcanic eruption when the site was occupied, implying that this painting was actually depicting a real event, right? So that was news about Çatalhöyük that was, again, appeared only in the last week or two. Another depiction of a wild animal. This is an aurochs. The aurochs is a wild bull, right? And you can see it's distorted in terms of proportions, right? The wild bull was never this big, but it shows the importance of the bull in, we think, their religion. So here you can see a hunting scene. This is another hunting scene, hunting deer. And they also had rooms with plastered skulls of bulls, right? So bulls' skulls plastered into the walls, as you can see here in some of these shrines. This is a bench with bulls' horns along either side. Again, probably for ritual use. Another depiction of leopards on the walls. And this is another shrine you can see with bull's horns, or reconstruction of a shrine with bull's horns. And this is a CGI kind of model of one. Well, what's sort of interesting about this is that this is a Neolithic site. Most of the animals that they used for food were domestic, but most of the animals they're depicting on the walls are wild. Right? So in terms of ritual importance, wild animals are much more important than the animals they're using for most of their diet. That's the one kind of strange thing about it. The other thing is that bulls in many societies represent male fertility, right? And so that might be what they represent here in Çatalhöyük. In many cultures, bulls represent male fertility. In another part of the site, they found also figurines, and this is a figurine that we've talked about, sort of this kind of figurine before. And, it looks like a figurine that would represent female fertility. Right? So some of these actually show women giving birth. This is what looks like a pregnant woman in between two lions. Right? So there's this interesting sort of element going on here with fertility, but also wild animals. So it's sort of the wild, the tamed, fertility. Then there's also the vultures, symbols of death, usually in many cultures. So you kind of have this interesting kind of juxtaposition of elements in the religion of Çatalhöyük. And we think that the religion was probably based on a fertility cult, which is different than what you see in the Levant, Jericho and Ain Ghazal, because that religion was based mainly on an ancestor worship. So you have two different religions around the same time in two different areas. It shows that there were cultural differences in different parts of the Middle East. Now, Çatalhöyük had a lot of shrines, and so some people believe that it may have been sort of a religious center, you might say, in the area. That is, it may have been an area where people made pilgrimages there because of all the shrines. It was also, as we said, economically important because it was located right near an obsidian source, right? And so this is what Çatalhöyük looked like back then, right? So you can see some of the diversity of what's going on after agriculture is firmly established in the Middle East, right? So again, just to recap, right? And this is something that you will have to remember for the first quiz, but one of the best ways to think about what we've been talking about so far is a large story, right? This is really a story of human history, and one event leads to the next event, right? So rather than thinking about these three time periods as completely separate from each other, and basically you have to memorize what happens in each period, think of it more in terms of the large story. You know the end of the story. The end of the story is agriculture. You know the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story is Ice Age hunters and gatherers who are mobile, right? Now you kind of have to fill in the blanks in between. And we talked about what happens, right? So first they become sedentary, right? Then the climate changes. During that process of adjusting to that climate change, they develop domesticated plants. That's at the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic A, right? They begin experimenting or continue experimenting with animals. By the time we get to the pre-pottery Neolithic B, we have domesticated animals, right? So it's this process of becoming sedentary, then domesticating plants, then domesticating animals, right? Okay, so the Neolithic in Europe occurred in a different way. Let me just switch over here. Okay, so one thing we have to remember is that once you have farming, uh, it has a tremendous impact on the environment, and this is something that you're going to see in one of the videos called "Stories from the Stone Age." It talks about Ein Gazal. Right? What archaeologists have seen at Ein Gazal is that that area used to be forested and it no longer is. And the reason why is because human beings cut down the forest and it was never able to grow back. So humans had a big impact on their local environments in ancient times. This is not just a modern phenomenon. Okay, another hypothesis for agriculture, which I find kind of interesting and humorous at the same time, is the beer hypothesis, right? And the idea behind this is that the incentive to domesticate barley and wheat was because it was the main ingredient to make beer, right? And why was beer important in ancient times? Well, beer was much safer to drink than water, right? You have to think that many parts of the world today, or some parts of the world today, farmers treat the river as their drinking source, but also as their disposal source of human waste and other waste. Right? So their drinking water can come from the same source. It can be contaminated, and it could bring on illness. When you make beer, you're producing alcohol, obviously. An alcohol content of 3% or more will kill off bacteria that's in that liquid. So, in essence, if you drink beer, you're not getting all that bacteria that's going to cause diarrhea and maybe even kill you, right? Like schistosomiasis and things like that. So, beer had that benefit, and also beer had mind-altering properties, which people would have probably enjoyed, and also seen maybe in a religious context. So, how was beer made? Well, we think that the earliest beer, it was not boiled, but what they started off obviously with barley. And, we know that what has to happen is yeast has to act on the sugars and it produces alcohol. Well, wheat, the way it is, sitting on the ground, the carbohydrates are too complex for yeast to act upon. Okay, so what if you put barley in water? If you put barley grains in water, they start to germinate. When they start to germinate, the small germ inside the seed, it starts to break down the complex carbohydrates into sugar. Then yeast can act on that and start eating the sugars and producing alcohol. Obviously, ancient people didn't know this, but they realized that the first step was to put barley in water, and then it would become fizzy after a week, and then it would taste better and have all these mind-altering properties, right? And so when the barley in water starts to germinate, that is called malt, right? So when you hear about malt in beer, malted beverages, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about this barley that's become broken down into sugars, essentially, naturally. Right? So this is one idea. Unfortunately, the beer hypothesis doesn't have a lot of evidence yet, at least in the Middle East. There is some evidence for alcohol early on in China, but with the beginnings of agriculture in the Middle East, you don't have pottery. So the remains of beer are hard to get at. So we don't really know, but it's an interesting idea. Okay, the Neolithic in Europe. We'll look just a little bit at how agriculture arose and spread in Europe, right? And there's a couple of important developments that occur. Right? To start off with, the Mesolithic in Europe was a lot like the Mesolithic in the Near East. You had hunters and gatherers living in a much better environment. They could start getting more food locally after the Ice Age, right? So just like the Middle East. right? Okay, well, how did farming develop, or how was it invented in Europe, right? Well, there's a couple of theories. Uh, the first theory has to do with just looking at the map of the Middle East and Europe, right? Çatalhöyük is about here, right? Here's Istanbul, ancient Constantinople, right? Half of Istanbul is in Asia. The other half of Istanbul, you can see, is in Europe, right? And this western coast of Turkey is very close to the Balkans here, right? Well, one theory, not too surprising, is that how did agriculture get to Europe? It moved from the Middle East into Europe, right? Now, it turns out that the earliest agricultural sites in Europe are here in Southeast Europe, the area that borders Turkey, the Middle East. Right? And so that certainly gives some support to that. But what people have found out is that it's more complicated than this. Right? That is, how did it get there in the first place? Well, there are certain theories. One is that the plants moved through trade. Right? That's what we might call diffusion. Right? Another idea is the idea of domestication moved from the Middle East to Europe. That's another version of diffusion. Another idea is that people in large numbers moved from the Middle East into Europe. This is what we would call migration. And then the final idea is that people in Europe on their own independently invented agriculture. Right? So independent invention is another aspect to this. So we have diffusion, migration, and independent invention. And it turns out that when we look at agriculture in Europe as a whole, all three of these have a role to play in the arrival of agriculture and development of agriculture in Europe. Okay, so it looks like the earliest agriculture, as we said, is in the Balkans, right? Right here in Greece, Bulgaria, right? Very, very close to Turkey, as you can see, right? Well, originally, archaeologists thought that wheat and barley and sheep only exist in the Middle East and didn't exist in Europe. Turns out that some of the ancestors of sheep and some of these cereal grains also existed in Europe at the same time as well, right? So that made the story a little bit more complex, right? Okay, so when you look at Greece, the Balkans, right, Bulgaria, this is when you have the first agriculture in Europe. And then one site over here called Agrisa, there's agriculture around 6000 BC. So that's the time period, around the PPNB, or a little bit slightly later than the PPNB. So that is much earlier than archaeologists originally thought. Right? So this is a site with the same climate as Turkey, and it has a very similar site to sites in the Middle East. Right? It's a tell. They were making their houses out of mud bricks. They had domesticated wheat and barley. They had cattle, sheep, and pig bones. Right? Okay, so once agriculture appears in southeastern Europe, you can see here, it then starts to spread to other parts of Europe. And as it spreads and is adopted into other parts of Europe, it takes on a very different character, right? That is, the culture that we see in southeastern Europe is different than the agricultural cultures we see in Central Europe and in Northern Europe. Well, why? Well, it's sort of obvious, but we have different peoples living here for one, and also the climate is very different here than it is in Southeastern Europe, right? For one, Southeastern Europe is fairly dry, Mediterranean kind of climate. Houses made out of mud bricks. When you get up to Central Europe, Northern Europe, the climate is obviously a lot wetter, it's a lot colder, the growing season is shorter, and that put some challenges on the people living and trying to make agriculture thrive in Europe, right? So we're going to see that it takes on a different character. Well, how did the agriculture migrate up into Central and then Northern Europe? Well, if you're an agricultural farmer, you're going to basically try to stick to where the water is the best because you need the water for your crops. So you're going to kind of stick to rivers. And as it gets a little bit crowded, you might move further and further north along the river. Right, well, it turns out that the Danube River moves from southeastern Europe all the way up through Central Europe and into parts of Northern Europe. So the road that was taken essentially by farmers into Central and Northern Europe was the Danube River. And it turns out that almost all of the early agricultural sites in this part of Europe are right along the Danube. The other interesting thing is that as farmers are moving into Central and Northern Europe, they are coming into contact with hunters and gatherers who were living there for a long period of time before they arrived. And so hunting and gathering and agriculture overlap in time for actually quite a long period in Europe. Right? Okay, so it looks like from the archaeology of Central and Northern Europe that agriculture started in southeastern Europe through probably diffusion of plants, diffusion of the technology, and also some migration of people. It's being debated now how much migration was involved. Then the migration of those farmers was instrumental in moving agriculture northwards into Central and then Northern Europe. The other element shows that independent invention, right, or some local development was important in this process. How do we know this? Right? Well, from several pieces of evidence, right? And I'm going to show you a couple of them, right? But we know this from one, pigs that were domesticated in Europe, right? The pigs that were domesticated in Europe, the early pigs that were domesticated in Europe, genetically are shown to be from the Middle East, right? The later pigs that you find in Europe are pigs that genetically derive from a European population. What does that mean? It means that pigs from the Middle East moved up into Europe, people in Europe used them, then they took the idea of domestication and then they applied it to the animals around them and then ended up domesticating their own pigs in that area. Right? Another important characteristic in Europe you can see here is lactose intolerance, right? The milk revolution, as it says here. Right? It turns out that Europeans, right, in Northern Europe have greater lactose tolerance as adults than peoples in the Middle East, right? And so you can see here, right, lactose tolerance over 80%, 60%, 40%. But down here, adult lactose tolerance is actually quite low. Here people mainly get their dairy products from yogurt, which does not have as much lactose. But up here we're talking about people who are drinking milk, right? Not yogurt, but they're drinking milk, which has a lot of lactose. If you're lactose intolerant and you drink milk, it actually can have a real bad effect on you. What archaeologists think was going on here is that because of the climate of Europe, people might have faced more difficulty in terms of agriculture, right? And so they might have had hard times. During those hard times, what could get them through a period of starvation was milk. People who had a genetic, basically the genes for lactose tolerance would be more likely to survive those conditions. People who are lactose intolerant would be less likely to survive those hard times and less likely to pass down their genes. And therefore, eventually, the genes that coded for more lactose tolerance would be greater in this area because there was a selective force behind it. Right? So that's one explanation as to why Northern Europeans have greater lactose tolerance than peoples from the Mediterranean, especially the eastern and southern Mediterranean. Right? Okay, well, we're going to stop here for this lecture, and we're going to pick this up on Wednesday and talk more about agriculture in Europe. So I'd like you to prepare. There's a few articles on Blackboard about agriculture in Europe. One is about human migration into Europe and how that had an impact. There's another article about the pigs that we just talked about. I'd like you to read those. I'd also like you to look at, I think there's an article about the paleo diet. You don't have to read too much about it. Just familiarize yourself with what the paleo diet is. We're going to talk about next week. And what I'd like you to do is to think about, first off, what is the paleo diet, if it's feasible, if it's viable for someone to do, if the paleo diet can be used by a large population of people throughout the world, what are the drawbacks of the paleo diet, what are the benefits of the paleo diet, right? So what I like to do is I try to take some of the things we're talking about in class and try to apply it to important things today. So you sort of can see, I think, the connections between the archaeology and then some of the things that are going on today, some of the issues, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'm going to get there are two videos that are on Blackboard. One is Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I want you to watch, and I'm also getting the Stories from the Stone Age. I'm going to put that up on Blackboard as well. So have a good weekend, have a good Martin Luther King Day, and I will see you on Wednesday. Thanks.